SAS veteran Ben Roberts-Smith is used to the front line, but for the past 5 years he's been battling to protect his reputation through the courts. The allegations against him shaking the Defence Force to its core.
This case goes to the heart of what it means to be an Australian soldier.
It's an absolutely extraordinary case in terms of the scale. The legal fees are reported to be running around $25 million, which is extraordinary. And the stakes are very high.
Ben Roberts-Smith joined the Australian Defence Force in 1996, serving in East Timor and then in Afghanistan with the SAS. In 2011, he was declared a war hero, receiving the military's highest honour for bravery, the Victoria Cross. But today, that all came crashing down after he lost his case against 3 newspapers, The Age, the Sydney Morning Herald and the Canberra Times. Justice Anthony Basanko ruled that the publications had been able to prove as substantially true that Ben Roberts-Smith was involved in the unlawful killing and assault of unarmed Afghan prisoners.
In light of my conclusions, each proceeding must be dismissed. At this point, I would ordinarily publish my reasons, but I understand that the Commonwealth has an application to make in that regard.
There are cases of allegations of war crimes over our history, but this is by far the largest and most significant. The allegations are by far the most atrocious and most serious.
In previous hearings of this trial, Ben Roberts-Smith was a silent and impassive presence, arriving and leaving the court without saying anything to the media. But on Judgment Day, he was a no-show, reportedly holidaying in Bali. That left his legal team to brave the onslaught of the media.
Will you appeal?
We'll obviously consider the lengthy judgment that His Honour has delivered.
Media mogul Kerry Stokes, who bankrolled Ben Roberts-Smith's legal case, has reportedly expressed his disappointment, saying, "The judgment does not accord with the man I know. I know this will be particularly hard for Ben, who has always maintained his innocence." For the journalist who faced 5 years of uncertainty, there was more to say.
Today is a day of justice. It's a day of justice for those brave men of the SAS who stood up and told the truth about who Ben Roberts-Smith is, a war criminal, a bully and a liar. Today is a day of some small justice for the Afghan victims of Ben Roberts-Smith. Ali Jan was the man kicked off the cliff. Ali Jan was a father. Ali Jan was a husband. He has children who no longer have a father. He has a wife who no longer has a husband.
In extraordinary scenes over 100 days, de-identified current and former SAS members broke their code of silence to give evidence for and against Ben Roberts-Smith.
I don't want people to think of this as a bad day for Australian soldiers. I think of those soldiers that not only had physical courage but also moral courage. Nick and I know them well. We've spent a lot of time with them, and I'm proud that they're out there.
Nick, what should happen to his awards, his Victoria Cross?
Now's the time for the nation and the Defence Force to absorb what the judge has found. The full findings will be released in due course. What is clear is Ben Roberts-Smith is a liar. Someone described Ben Roberts-Smith to me as the Lance Armstrong of the Australian military.
It's a remarkable win for the media, which often fails in defending defamation cases.
There have been many witnesses who have been relied upon by the media to attempt to establish the truth. And it comes down to a matter of evidence, whether or not there is sufficient evidence to make out the substantial truth of each of the imputations that have been pleaded.
The full judgment won't be made public until Monday, after the Commonwealth succeeded in delaying the release for national security reasons. In the meantime, Ben Roberts-Smith could face the possibility of criminal prosecution.
I think it was a great call back in June 2018 to run that story. I think it will go down in the history of the news business as one of the great calls.
I spoke to reporter Nick McKenzie after the judgment. Nick Mackenzie, at the opening of this defamation case more than a year ago, the barrister for Ben Roberts-Smith said this was a case about, quote, dishonesty, corrosive journalism, cowardice and lies. How high were the stakes for you today?
Well, they were incredibly high, and of course they were the terms that he applied to us journalists and to the SAS witnesses, our witnesses, who stood in court eventually and accused Robert Smith of war crimes. And now it can be said that those same terms actually apply to Ben Roberts-Smith. He's the liar. He's the war criminal. He's been exposed as trying to pull off the biggest con in legal and military history. And thank God the federal court saw through it.
Now, let's just go to the most serious events at the centre of your reporting. What do those events tell us about who Ben Roberts-Smith is?
Well, I mean, the core allegation, the foundation stone of our initial reporting and much of the case involves a mission to Darwin, a civilian farmer, a father of many children, a husband called Ali Jan. He was detained along with many other men in the village of Darwin. What we reported and what has been now proven by the court, found to be true, is that he was interrogated by Robert Smith. He smiled at Robert Smith. Robert Smith, he was led to the edge of a cliff. This is Ali Jan. Robert Smith kicked him off the edge of a cliff. His body, still alive, was dragged at the base of the cliff, taken to underneath a tree, and then Robert Smith is implicated in this man, Ali Jan's, summary execution. What does that say about Ben Roberts-Smith? It says this is a soldier in the most elite unit in Australia's military, prepared to break the laws, the rules of engagement, and then to cover up this shocking crime, not just an absolute appalling moral failure by a person, but then to come back to Australia, to cover it up, and then to launch a lawsuit. It was his choice to go to court. And the premise of that lawsuit was this was all a lie. He brought on this case. He was the one saying this never happened. Ali Jan was a hostile insurgent who was shot according to the rules of armed conflict. That was a lie. But what does that say about Robert Smith? The fact he brought this on, it says he is what his barrister actually said. We called him an ostentatious psychopath.
Now, I noticed outside court you spoke about Ali Jan's family. Have you remained in contact with the family of this victim and other victims in this story?
We met the family. We met Ali Jan's children. We met his grieving wife. You could absolutely see the grief still many years afterwards on her face. It's very hard to remain in contact with people in Afghanistan, especially since the fall of Kabul, but we have stayed in sporadic touch with some of the villagers who assisted us. It wasn't just brave SAS soldiers who came to court and told the truth about what Ben Roberts-Smith did, but Afghan villagers. You know, the relatives of Ali Jan, one of them was detained alongside him, came to court and said, I saw this man, my relative, kicked off the cliff. He was derided in court. He was belittled by Ben Roberts-Smith's barristers. He was brave enough to stand up despite the potential for blowback from the Taliban. And he's been believed, along with the SAS soldiers who corroborated his account, he corroborated theirs, and our other Afghan villagers also were corroborated. We're in touch with some of those witnesses still. They're going to be appearing on 60 Minutes this weekend to tell us more of their story. And they're also the heroes of this story.
It does raise a question, just before we come more to the case, but just in terms of the journalism that you did, this is a place that's difficult to report in. It's far away, it's complex, it was a war zone when these events happened, with all that implies. How difficult was it to assemble the facts that you needed for the initial reporting and then for the case?
Definitely the most difficult undertaking of my 21-year career. Dare say the most difficult undertaking of my colleague Chris Masters' 40-year plus career. Chris Masters, an absolute legend of investigative journalism, and that's no small thing. The toughest assignment Chris Masters has ever done. We did it together. It was extremely difficult, not just to navigate the situation in Afghanistan, but to break the code of silence in the SAS. We needed Special Forces soldiers to trust Chris and I, and some of them did. And really, the great relief for us wasn't winning in court for our sake. It was for the sake of the families, the victims, but also for the sake of those soldiers who trusted us, because finally they have been believed. And, you know, what is the penalty? What is the price for speaking up within the SAS against the Victorian Cross recipient? they come after you. Men have been intimidated, threatened, bullied, sometimes by Ben Roberts-Smith himself. But enough brave men in the SAS stood up and told the truth. And for them, I'm just so relieved that the case has vindicated what they did.
You just talked about this a bit. You're talking about an investigation of a war hero, and this is in a nation that venerates heroism in war. How much more complicated did that make the job that you had to do?
Endlessly more complicated. The amount of times people have said to me, well, you didn't go to war, so how can you judge? Or have said, well, how can it be murder in the field of war? And the answer to both those questions is this. It was Robert Smith's own colleagues who did go to war, who fought alongside him, who served with absolute distinction, who put their lives on the line. It was they who were horrified about what they saw. It was their truth. There are rules and laws in war. It is unlawful to murder a civilian. It is unlawful to murder a prisoner with his hands bound, which was one of the allegations that's been upheld by the court. It was these men who did deploy and saw things that morally were not right to them, that led to them to speak up and put us on our path. And ultimately, we were guided by their moral revulsion, and we reported their truth, and that's been upheld today.
Now, come to the case, because this was it was an extraordinarily complex case. There were obviously areas of it that went into national security. Just tell me a bit about the experience of the case for you.
Well, over 100 days of trial, many more days than that of trial preparation, of simply finding witnesses. It was, without doubt, the most anxiety-ridden, difficult experience, not just as a journalist, but in my life. I know Chris Masters felt it the same. There were many...
sorry to interrupt you, but did you ever wish you hadn't embarked on this course? Did you ever doubt your capacity to see it through, or wish it hadn't started in the first place?
To be honest, there were times when you absolutely were filled with self-doubt. You wouldn't be human, not just for the fact that our reputations were on the line, but that we were worried we would let down our sources, that those guys in the SAS were worried would let down the victims in Afghanistan. There was huge moments of self-doubt and times where you're lying in a ball on the floor in your home. There were times when my own young children would ask, who's Ben Roberts-Smith? Why do you keep worrying about him, Dad? The law is not a friendly place for journalists. I can tell you our legal team was as anxious as us, but we also knew that it was the truth. And if we could just get the witnesses to court on oath to tell the truth.
But that's incredibly difficult.
It was so difficult. We had to use subpoenas. No one in the SAS wanted to come to court to testify against their own colleague for obvious reasons. The blowback they would face would be immense. If witnesses got to court, would they lie to protect their brother soldier? But what does this tell us? It actually tells us the moral heart of the SAS is solid. These guys were prepared to come and stand up and tell the truth. And they did that, and they were believed, and a judge has absolutely vindicated them. And that's what kept, I guess, the endless anxiety at bay, knowing that the truth had our backs.
Were you ever shocked by the way the array of powerful figures against you behaved?
I remain shocked to this day. Kerry Stokes financed Ben Roberts-Smith, this defamation fight. This is a media proprietor who should believe in journalism. Yet he was waging a huge war against investigative journalism. What does that say? That there are questions that only Kerry Stokes can answer, but what does that say about his support of the media? Brendan Nelson, the former Defence Minister, was a character witness for Ben Roberts-Smith, got up repeatedly in public and stood by him.
Now, this was a defamation case where Ben Roberts-Smith's reputation is primarily on trial. What happens next? These are war crimes that were being discussed in the court. What happens next in relation to the crimes that you reported on?
Well, what's happened today, a civil court, to the balance of probabilities, it's a lesser standard than a criminal court, has found the allegations of war crimes to be true. We know that the Office of Special Investigations, we know the Federal Police are investigating Ben Roberts-Smith. That came out in court. It's a fact. It's now for the Commonwealth authorities to keep gathering the evidence. I'm sure they're looking very closely at our case. But of course, they do have that different standard of proof. If the Director of Public Prosecutions believes there's enough evidence at the end of the day to prosecute, that's a decision down the track. then that is what will occur. But that's a long way to get to. I think what this case, though, does tell the nation is there needs to be more accountability. Yes, journalism has been vindicated, but there's not real justice for the victims in Afghanistan. There is not real justice for the SAS whistleblowers unless the criminal justice system, the ultimate system of accountability, kicks in. I think that's the next place where this scandal will go.
Nick Mackenzie, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Dr Matt Collins, KC, is a media law barrister and the former president of the Australian Bar Association. Matt Collins, welcome to 7:30. Now, Nick Mackenzie just said that the law is not a friendly place for journalists. Why is that?
He's right about that. So at core, our defamation laws date back to the English common law, sort of 19th century and even before. And they haven't evolved in the same way that they have in the countries that we most like to compare ourselves to, like the United States with its First Amendment tradition, even the United Kingdom when it was part of the European Union and became party to the European Convention on Human Rights. You know, Australia doesn't have any broad-based protection for freedom of speech or freedom of the press of the kind that those other countries have.
So, and we're talking about extremely brave reporting of the highest calibre. But let me ask you this first of all, which I've been thinking about since the decision came down. Why would Ben Roberts-Smith bring a case like this when he had so much to lose?
You know, it's a catastrophic miscalculation, isn't it? And what the judge has found, I mean, these were irreconcilable versions of events. Ben Roberts-Smith vigorously denied the allegations that Nick and the others had reported. Someone had to be lying, and the judge has found in substance that Ben Roberts-Smith was lying about the central claims made in the 9 stories. Now, the implications are obviously far-reaching. He's lost the case, and that will have a financial consequence, but much more seriously than that, he's now been found to the civil standard by a judge of the Federal Court of Australia after a very hard-fought case to have committed murder, to have committed war crimes. To have shamed his nation. Those are findings that will dog him forever.
Now, at the same time, so that people understand, this was a civil case, not a criminal case. What's the difference, essentially, between those two ways of judging a matter?
So it resides in a number of things, but principally the standard of proof. So Ben Roberts-Smith has not been charged with anything, he's not been convicted of anything, he's been found on the balance of probabilities in a civil court. That means it's more likely than not that he did the things, the central claims that 9 alleged against him. In a criminal court, it would be quite different. So the prosecution would have different duties and, of course, also have coercive powers that are not available to private litigants like 9. Ben Roberts-Smith would have entitlement to the privilege against self-incrimination, the right to silence, and the benefit of the higher standard. In a criminal court, the trial would be before a jury and he would only be convicted if the jury was satisfied that the prosecution had proved the offences beyond reasonable doubt.
What difference does it make in this case that there wasn't a jury? Because there obviously sometimes are juries in civil cases, but to have a judge, an extremely complex case, how important was it that this was just a judge?
Well, it's going to prove to be very significant because we'll see the reasons for judgment that Justice Bazanko has prepared. He is, I can say, a meticulous judge who presided over this case, you know, with great patience and equanimity. This will be a very long judgment, and a jury doesn't give you a written reason for its outcome, but a judge does, and so that means it'll be open to Ben Roberts-Smith and his team to pore over the reasons and see whether there are potential grounds for challenging it.
Now, at the same time, at the core of this case are allegations of war crimes, complex allegations and difficult to prove. Is a civil trial the right place to try war crimes?
Well, certainly not a defamation courtroom is not the right place. I mean, people would be surprised, I think, that this defamation trial really was a war crimes trial masquerading as a defamation trial, in the sense that the issues in the case came down to whether a private litigant, 9, and the journalists could prove what is in substance a criminal offence, albeit to the lower civil standard. I would like to see the battleground in these defamation cases to focus more upon the public interest component of the journalism. Was the journalism responsible? Was it in the public interest? Did the public have the right to know what was published or broadcast? In this case, none of that really got a look in because of the way our defamation laws operate. The case came down to, as I say, a proxy war crimes trial.
So that wasn't a choice by 9 to to run the case in that way?
It was a choice. So at the time these articles were published, this is back in 2018, Australia had a very limited defence for the media where it had acted reasonably in all the circumstances. That defence is widely perceived in my industry as being a dead letter, and Nine didn't rely on it for whatever reason. From the 1st of July 2021, so too late for this case, a new defence has been introduced in most states and territories, including New South Wales, that would have, if it had been relied on by Nine, led to the trial being conducted on a quite different basis.
Does that new law mean that the kind of the calibre of reporting that we're seeing here is likely to be better protected, a bit more like in those other jurisdictions and countries that we compare ourselves to?
Well, I think that's the hope. I mean, that's the philosophy underlying the introduction of the new defence was that our law has been too strict, particularly in cases involving serious investigative journalism, and this is obviously journalism of that calibre, but time will tell whether the law proves effective and whether it's interpreted in the liberalising way in which Parliament's intended.
I just want to come back to that first question around the idea of courts being unfriendly for journalists and the personal toll on Nick McKenzie and Chris Masters in particular. How hard is it for journalists, because Nick and Chris won't want to talk about this, how hard is it to be them in a case that is so gruelling and that goes on for so long with so much at stake?
It's very hard. These cases are enormous. I mean, it's very stressful for the plaintiff as well, the party who brings the case. They're stressful cases for all concerned because so much is on the line, and they become the topic for media fodder, as this case was. For the plaintiff, the damage that emerges from the trial can be greater than the damage from the original publications, even where the plaintiff is vindicated. For the journalists, a loss in a case like this would have been a catastrophe for Nick McKenzie's reputation. So I don't doubt for a moment that he felt very acutely the pressure of defending his writing.
You've also referenced the fact that this was a big media case. There were big players arrayed, particularly on Ben Roberts-Smith's side. Does that battle between the media giants seep into the courtroom?
We try not to. For the lawyers, I can tell you, we just want to focus on what's happening in the courtroom, and what's playing out in the court of public opinion is white noise, but it's part of the world in which the journalists operate, and it's obviously part of the interest of the story that in this case there was the 7 versus 9 angle with Ben Roberts-Smith as the general manager of Channel 7 Brisbane and being funded by the proprietor.
And finally, when we consider this case and the history of big media legal cases in Australia, how important is this?
It's an incredibly important case for serious investigative journalism in this country. A loss, I think, would have struck a very damaging blow to the preparedness of legacy media like the ABC, like Nine, like News Limited, to fund and then defend important stories of this kind.
Matt Collins, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
It's a pleasure.
And if you're a veteran or serving member and you and your family need help, you can call the organisation Open Arms on 1800 011 046.